So, without further delay, our first panellist, Póca Tuiflasi, is joining us online. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it here, but he is a youth disability advocate from Samoa. He joined the Deaf Association of Samoa as a member in 2018 and was nominated to the board in 2019. He has since gone on to be a child advisor to Child Rights Connect in Geneva and a member of the Children Human Rights Working Group for the Ombudsman and the National Human Rights Institution of Samoa. And he works to ensure that the voices and perspectives of children and youth who are deaf and hard of hearing from Samoa are represented in forums throughout the country and abroad to ensure that no child is left behind. So we'll have a video contribution from Póca now.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Póca Tuiflasi. I'm 18 years of age and I'm from Samoa. I am blessed to be one of the panelists today, as I am here to be the voice of our young people with disability of my country. I am from a family of 10, and I'm the sixth child of my parents. Growing up as the only child with disability, my family was my comfort zone. I reached my year 13 in school despite many challenges I have faced during all steps of my education year and limited resources and support. It is a great sad for me as I wasn't able to finish my first year at TVET due to no support, no interpreters, as the level of education was a bit too high for me. So I left school and stayed home doing nothing. And I was hopeless, sad. For me, I'm done. There's no chance for me to get educated and have a job. I joined Deaf Association in 2018. Deaf Association is led and governed by deaf and hard of hearing people. And our vision is to advocate for the voice of deaf and hard of hearing people. And for me, it is my first time to get involved with the organization of people with disability. And that is the first time I've been taught about my rights of persons with disability, including children with a disability. Samoa signed and ratified CRPD in 2016. I felt a bit disappointed and asked a question. Is that so? Why am I not able to finish my education then? Our disability advocacy organization has been working so hard to make sure our voice are be heard and got the opportunity to join the role of child advisor with the global non-profit group. Child Rights Connect is an independent non-profit global network of child rights organizations that work to ensure the realization of children's rights through the UN Human Rights System. Based in Geneva, Switzerland, and Child Rights Connect network is made up of over 85 multi-level organizations throughout the world. It provides technical assistance and capacity building to children's rights, defender internationally supporting organizations and advocates, including children, to identify appropriate entry for advocacy within the UN mechanism. It was such an experience. It amazed me with the level of inclusivity. We share our achievements, challenges, and way forward on how to address issue of children and young people with disability on the international level. One of my involvements, our national organization of our children working group to discuss children submission reporting to CRC. formally submit a submission to the government, either the Minister of Ministry of Women, Community and Social Development or the Prime Minister. We as a working group attend this handover update submission once the states provides national reports to the CRC committee. We conduct consultation and table discussion on how daily basics of children's rights, including children with disability. I've also joined Brown Girl Woke. Brown Girl Woke initiative empower youth in all levels, schooling and rural areas of Samoa by investing on their education, aspiration and success. I was involved in the Teo Leva. It's a mental health campaign. We went and conduct school awareness to educate our young generation the importance of mental health. In 2021, I was elected as a board member for Deaf Association of Samoa. By that time, I was only 17 years old. Deaf Association is a subgroup of Nonua Olealofa. It's a national advocacy organization. Has a nation already signed the CRBD and CRC, we have to submit a report to the UN. So we conduct consultation and interview to collect children with disability view and data information. Partnership with the Ministry of Education, Sports and Culture, we conduct inclusive education awareness for school principal, teachers. We present on the rights of a child with disability to have equal opportunity. We also provide the right support to be inclusive. From my experience as a youth with disability, without the support of our disability organization, we wouldn't have more involvement and creating platform of our people with disability to address our human rights. We have a space in the national and international level for our voice to be heard, our concern, and talk about our rights, same as others. So we all stand together to support our movement, our human rights for all, including children with disability. I wish all the best for Appetite.
Thank you very much, Tupoka, for that. Really interesting to hear, picking up on the discussions this morning about the absence of support and interpreters and how that impacts on the right to education, as well as his direct experience of reporting and the value of organisations such as CRC Connect, and indeed, again from this morning, the advocacy needed after ratification of a UN convention to ensure that actually impacts in practice. So next up in the room we have Anita Franklin, who is a professor at the University of Portsmouth and has over 25 years of experience undertaking policy and practice focused research with and alongside disabled children and young people. Her work predominantly examines issues of agency, rights, protection, inequality and inclusion. And Anita's research on disabled child abuse and disabled young adults who have experienced sexual and domestic violence has sought to ensure that survivors' voices are central. Anita has developed methodologies to empower disabled young people to become research leaders, undertaking all aspects of the research cycle and utilising research evidence to lobby for change. Thanks, Anita.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all okay and not too tired after a nice lunch and a hot day. So my name's Anita Franklin. I'm actually here speaking on behalf of a team of people, and I think it's very important to start with that team. So my very great colleague is Zara Todd, who's a disability rights activist, and I know probably a number of people who are part of INIL here will know of Zara Todd, and if you don't, you probably should, because she's a wonderful person and a wonderful colleague. And I'm also here speaking on behalf of a group of disabled young researchers. I'll explain who they are in a second, but the group is called VIPER. they call themselves Vipers. And Viper stands for Voice, Inclusion, Participation, Empowerment and Research. They named themselves Viper. The title of my presentation, I'm going for the world's longest title ever. It says, they still need to listen more, working in partnership with disabled young researchers to inform and shape country submissions to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. So I want to share with you this case study example of how we actually contributed to our country submission in England, in the UK. So, Viper Disabled Young Researchers, I'll give a little bit of explanation of what they did. So they were commissioned by the Children's Commissioner in England to develop a submission to the UN CRPD as part of the UK shadow reporting process. So, as we've already heard this morning, as part of the UN CRPD, each country is inspected over a cycle every few years to see how the country are doing. Normally the government reports on how they're doing, and I always feel that's a bit like you marking your own score and your own homework, if the governments are actually saying how well they're doing. So as part of that, civil society, charities, NGOs can also submit a report to sometimes give a differing picture, shall we say, of what's happening in countries in their country. So as part of this project these young people were involved in, they were commissioned by the Children's Commission in England to develop a submission that the Children's Commissioner was going to submit as part of the inspection process in the UK. So in England, the Children's Commissioner is a government-appointed official. They're funded by the government to have responsibility to promote and protect the rights of children. So it's a senior post in government, very respected post with a lot of power. So we were hoping that working in partnership with her at that time would actually help us to actually make a difference and get on the agenda disabled young people's rights. So what they did was they designed and undertook a national research consultation with disabled children and young people in England to examine whether their rights had been enacted. They then co-wrote a report and developed recommendations that formed part of civil society report that went to the United Nations. So before I explain what they did, I'll just take a sidestep and explain what I mean by being a disabled young researcher and what being a Viper meant. So the group, the Vipers, I set up, we're going back about 12 years now. This group of young people from across England. They were recruited via schools, youth groups. They didn't have to have any particular skills. They weren't academics, they're not activists. They were just young people who identified as disabled young people who were involved somehow in their community or in their school and felt that maybe they'd like to get involved in something. They were sent accessible information on what becoming a researcher means, what they would be doing in the group, expectations of them, what it means, what they would have to bring to the group. And then we asked them 3 simple questions as an application form. So it was, why do they want to get involved? What do they feel they can contribute to the group? So very open, accessible questions for anybody. And we got quite a number of applications. So we did a very short, easy sifting to get a group of 14 young people together. And I think it's really important at that stage that they knew they didn't need to have any specific skills or educational ability, because so many barriers were put up for these young people to take part in this project. People saying how can you become a young researcher if, creating barriers that didn't exist. It was important that they and their parents or carers could ask us questions before making a decision about being part of this group. And it was important that they knew that we could meet their access needs and that we could be flexible. Because again, I think barriers are put up that you need to be a certain type of young person or only have certain needs to be able to be a young researcher or to be part of a group that does activism. I think the other important thing about the group as well, the staff team, so myself and Zara, we have a background in youth work, we have a background in activism, and we have a background in academic research. And those skills combined, I think, supported this group to do what they do. So the Vipers are a group of 16 young people, aged 12 to 21 years. We don't work through a medicalised model, but normally at this point, someone says to me almost kind of, what's their impairment? What's their disability? So all I say is that they're pan impairment. We don't actually put up any barriers for anyone to join our group. As long as we can meet their needs within the resources we have, then anyone's allowed to join our group. It's rural and urban, range of ethnicities, a range of experiences. So underpinning what we do, we have a strong methodology and approach. So we're underpinned by the social model of disability. So what I mean by that is that we try to overcome any barriers that those young people may face to becoming a young researcher. So that might be attitudinal, changing the attitudes of those around them that might think they can't do this. It's about breaking down barriers in terms of access, process, information. We just work with the young person to work out a way that they can become a young researcher. We always work through a human rights framework as well. So once we recruited these young people, they're supported and trained in research and disability rights. So I teach at a university research methodology. I don't teach it in any different way with these young people. All I do is make it more accessible. So we still learn all those technical terms, we still learn about ethics, we still learn about different research methods. We just make it accessible to the needs of that group. We have a shared decision-making model. So as the young people gain more experience and more confidence, they'll take on more responsibility within the group. And that has increasingly led to them being leaders in this group. So we work as one team. Then the group undertake research, consultation and deliver training in order to influence policy and practice. So disabled children and young people's views are always central to what they do. So when they do their research, they always make sure that they're involving other disabled children and young people in this. Although they do undertake work with professionals and with government, as in this example, because they know quite often it's those people that have the power to make change. Okay. So, unfortunately, I couldn't bring any of the Vipers with me. This work is a little bit old now, and those Vipers have grown up, as children do, and they've gone off and done wonderful things. So actually, I've got another new group that was born out of the Vipers called the RIP Stars. They wanted their own identity, so they named themselves, which stands for, RIP Stars stands for Research into Policy and Practice, Skilled Team with Ambition, Rights and Strength. So same model, same method, just a new group of young people that are active now. One of the criticisms I was given, and rightly so, about this model was it's okay for you in England with lots of resources, the methodology, the way you're working is quite UK-centric. So we wanted to test whether this model would work in different countries. So just before the first lockdown in England, we won funding from the British Academy to test out whether this methodology of working with young disabled researchers would work in the global south. So we had to wait 2+ years to start this project. And finally, last May, I was able to visit the Philippines, and we set up RIP Stars Philippines. So on the slides, you'll see the young people actually have gone to the Philippines to train some young people in the Philippines to be young researchers there. So we're learning about how this model can work in different countries. That's coming to an end soon, so if people are interested, I can share that with them. Okay, so getting back to what they did in terms of the UNCRPD and the UNCRC. We've already heard this morning about young disabled people falling between the gaps of the UNCRPD and the gaps of the UNCRC. So really what we were trying to do was place a focus and give give attention and enable young disabled people across England to have a voice in those processes, so that their views and opinions weren't missed in this reporting process. So they were commissioned by the Children's Commissioner to do this piece of work. We feel that it could be a framework that works for involving disabled young people in human rights monitoring. We think it challenges that invisibility, and we think it contests the often held assumptions that disabled young people neither have the capacity nor skills to do research, to be involved in consultations, or to have to be able to influence and affect government. So we tried in our project to hold the Children's Commissioner to account. We tried through our project to make it clear that disabled children and young people can be involved in all of those things if decision makers are prepared to share power and recognise the rights and strengths of disabled children and young people. So we worked in partnership with the Children's Commissioner. The Vipers designed, delivered and undertook focus groups with disabled children and young people across England. They then analysed the findings and developed recommendations to inform the submission as part of the UK reporting process. So the way that we did that was we held two planning workshops, 2 days, with staff from the Children's Commissioner. The young people worked with the staff members to think through the ethical and safeguarding issues of a group of young people going out and seeking the views and opinions of another group of disabled young people. We worked on agreeing and developing a sample and the methods for consulting with disabled children across England. We also refreshed our memories around the CRPD and the reporting process, and then we systematically prioritised rights that we felt would be most important to examine. In total, 34 disabled children and young people took part in focus groups, fairly evenly split across genders, and they were aged between 5 and 24 years. And so the Vipers went out, they facilitated the focus groups, they collected the data. Drawing on their previous research, they tailored each focus group to meet the needs of the specific individuals in that group. So we found out some very basic information about how to make these groups accessible for whoever was there. They developed a menu of activities that could be carried out with different people. Same questions, same themes, same rights to explore, but just using creative means to be able to answer those questions. And they produced accessible information so that all young people could take part. After they did their focus groups, they came back and had another workshop with the Children's Commissioner, where they actually undertook thematic analysis of their data. Using a rights framework, they came up with the key themes that they wanted to go forward in the report. They also worked on developing key recommendations. And they worked with the Children's Commissioner back and forth to make sure that those recommendations were strong and the ones that they wanted to be as part of this report. Due to time constraints, the final report was written by the Children's Commissioner's office, but the Vipers absolutely argued that it had to be signed off by them, so they had the final decision on what went in that report. They also held a final workshop to develop an accessible version for disabled young people. So the impact of their work, what they were able to do was raise issues regarding the lack of disabled children and young people's rights across 13 articles of the CRPD. Based on the findings from this group, the English Children's Commissioner made 6 specific recommendations to the English government and as part of the civil society report. And the recommendations were around disability hate crime and victimisation and abuse, educational support, career opportunities, access to work and support to achieve independence, changing attitudes, access to appropriate welfare support to ensure basic needs are met. So a few reflections to finish up. When we were commissioned to do that piece of work, I'm not sure that the Children's Commissioner knew quite what she was expecting to get. The brief for what we were told that we had to do was very short. We had just short time span to do this piece of work. And I think that if we hadn't been an established group that were already trained, we wouldn't have been able to meet those short time scales. I think drawing on the young researchers' knowledge already of research, it meant that we could develop an equal partnership. The disabled young people in Vipers weren't afraid to question that person. They weren't afraid to push back. You know, there was a bit of a to and fro around the Vipers disabled young researchers wanting to include children who didn't use speech to communicate. So they pushed back on the timescale to enable us to be able to do that, to access that group and to give them some more time to be involved. So I think it's important learning that these Vipers weren't starting from scratch doing this piece of work. They're already empowered to suggest, lead and challenge. I think, do people get the overheads? So in the PowerPoint there's references to the report that they wrote. There's a reference as well to the actual Children's Commissioner's report, so you can see where those findings and the way in which they worked. There's also a paper that we've written in the International Handbook of Children's Rights and Disability that has just come out, where we reflect on this process and we reflect on the way in which we worked with the young people. The Vipers and the Ripstars, we work all the time reflecting on how we're working together. Are we doing things right? How could we improve? So that paper there is quite a reflective and honest piece about how we can, you know, how it worked and how it could be better. So thank you for listening. If anyone wants to contact me, I think go on that app thing or you can email me at anita.franklin@port.ac.uk. And the Ripstars have their own website and Twitter account, so if anyone does want to follow this group and see how they're getting on and their activism, I'm sure they'd be really pleased to talk with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anita. That was really interesting. Everything you were saying, especially around the short time frames being provided for research, I think that's everyone would recognise that and the barrier that can cause for meaningful participation. But it's really good to be talked through such a good practice example and your kind of expertise in it, and it's a really, as you talk through, it's a really accessible model that can hopefully be replicated in other countries. And for Ireland, hasn't been reviewed by the UN CRPD as of yet, so good for us to hear here as well about good models to take into account. So our final speaker is Esma Gumbaridze. She is a youth worker from Georgia. Her full biography is in the programme, so I won't read through it all. But just to say, she's been a member of a number of youth initiatives and international networks. So, for example, in Georgia, she's been the youth representative to the United Nations and a member of the Consultative Council on the Monitoring of UN CRPD implementation, protection and promotion with the Ombudsman's Office. She is currently an ambassador of the European Democracy Youth Network, and she also chairs the Disabled Women's Organisation Platform for New Opportunities and is a board member at the National Network of Women with Disabilities. So as I said, we'll hold the questions for all the panellists until the end, and hopefully Esma will be joining us at that point as well. So yeah, we'll hear from her online now.
Hi everyone, I will be speaking about involvement of young persons with disabilities in the monitoring, so basically oversight of the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCRPD, of its implementation. So how is it being enforced in different countries? I'll introduce myself. My name is Esma. I'm in my late 20s. I'm a young disabled woman, namely blind. I will describe myself. I am Eastern European. I have on light brown sweater, silver earrings, and silver chain. So first of all, the definition of youth is rather problematic around the world. The UN entities have different definitions. One is the age of 15-24. Another one by the UN Security Council is 18-29. The UN Habitat, so the UN Organization on Settlements, defines youth as people under 32 years of age. Some countries and international youth networks and organizations, donors, define youth as people below the age of 35. And I have heard of an organization here in the United States that said that they want to organize a forum to encourage young leaders with disabilities under age of 40. So these expansions of definition of youth once again show that countries and organizations and everyone has difficulty in engaging and ensuring that actual youth with disabilities is engaged. This is why they want to and tend to want to call older people also youth, because so that they would, it would be easier for them to say that they actually do involve and include youth with disabilities. Young people with disabilities are in a sort of a limbo because youth is not mentioned neither in the UNCRPD convention directly. We have children mentioned, but not youth. The same situation happens in both UN Youth Strategy and UN Disability Strategy, where they don't mention youth, they mention women and children. The same happens with the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security and youth peace and security. And the same happens actually with resolution on by the Security Council on protecting disabled persons in armed conflict. Well, first of all, I want to note here that it's different. So with UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security, and youth peace and security, the women and youth respectively are viewed as more of agents of change, as more of subjects. And in this resolution on protecting disabled persons with disabilities in armed conflict, persons with disabilities are viewed more as objects, as some people who need to be protected only, and not as parts of a proactive part of peace negotiation processes and peace building and peace keeping missions and so on and so forth. So we already can see differentiation here. Even all of these documents, talk about all young people and all women and all persons with disabilities. This already provides us with good ground to advocate that, of course, youth with disabilities is included there. However, at the same time, as youth is not explicitly mentioned, it means that it gives a lot of organizations an excuse to forget about us. I also will explain here that I will use term persons with disabilities and disabled persons interchangeably because on the one hand, I realize that it's UN terminology to use persons with disabilities. However, on the other hand, I also endorse the definition and the ideas by the European Network on Independent Living and some other organizations. The term disabled person actually speaks more to the fact that we are disabled by our environment. So it's more about social model. It expresses better social model of disability. I also tried to just Google youth participation in monitoring of the CRPD. And I also asked ChatGPT about this. And I did not find any information on best practices. The only thing I found out was about what should be done to include young persons with disabilities in CRPD monitoring. So this already speaks to the fact that we are not included quite well. And when inclusion of youth with disabilities happens, it's ad hoc, it's fragmented, and it's more incidental and accidental than because of some deliberate thought has been put into including us. Therefore, I will have to focus a lot on my personal example of how I was involved in this and also how other young people around me were involved in monitoring. A lot of young people are, of course, involved in monitoring in non-formal and informal ways. Just raising public awareness or addressing public officials without any official position, any official capacity. And oftentimes, we are sort of soothed by and try and calmed down by this idea that, well, young people don't like quote unquote formal institutions, but they are involved in policy and politics informally. However, it's very important for us also to have formal recognition and formal voice. Me, as a young woman with disabilities, it was very hard for me, and it is still very hard for me to make myself heard. I, a lot of times, am overpowered by other disabled people who are older than me, especially by men. And also, I'm not well listened to by the public officials. And, when there is a question whose opinion to count more, some older men with disabilities or an opinion of mine, of course, the former prevails. Yes. I have been involved in monitoring for probably 10 years or so, but first formal one was when I co-authored a research on employment of women with disabilities. It was funded by the Open Society Foundation in 2016. Then I was still in university in my third year of studies. Then in 2017, I joined the Ombudsman's Consultative Council on the monitoring of implementation, protection, and promotion of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the Ombudsman's Office, or Ombudsperson's Office in Georgia, is a national human rights institution. It is commissioned to oversee the general human rights situation in the country, according to our constitution. The ombudsperson is appointed by the majority of parliament members, so by the parliament, basically, with a majority vote. And it has an independent budget, which is not to be reduced. It can be only increased annually. So it does have a lot of institutional independence. And this is also, it also oversees the enforcement of the UNCRPD Convention. And it has a special department on disability, just like they have a department on gender equality, child center, the same way they have a department for disabled persons' rights, and we have a consultative council with that department there. And I joined it, as I said, in my early 20s, and a few other young people joined me as well there. And I know that other young people have been there before me and after I left the council as well. So there always are some young people as members of this council alongside the more experienced NGO, so non-governmental organization representatives. So the Consultative Council is composed of both OPD, so organizations of persons with disabilities, parents of disabled children and adults, and other organizations, human rights organizations that work on disability issues. In 2019, I was elected as Georgia's youth representative to the United Nations, or like youth delegate shortly. This position has been suggested by the UN Department on Economic and Social Affairs, the UNDSA, still in 1990s. So they asked the governments of countries to include youth delegates in their official delegations and their diplomatic missions and so on. Georgia started having youth delegates since 2012. So the youth delegates are being selected through a competitive process. It's a 3-round process. It has a selection committee. There are criteria that you have to qualify, and then once you are selected as youth delegate, you are provided funding to first travel around Georgia, meet Georgian young people, speak to them about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and agenda, and also find out about their needs, and then voice these needs at the UN General Assembly, also the UN Economic and Social Council or its Youth Forum in the official capacity. So you sit in a diplomatic seat of Georgia's permanent mission, and you speak deliver the speech on behalf of the Georgian youth. So I was selected, but again, not because of deliberate effort to find young person with disabilities who would fit in this role, but just because I had the privilege to know about this program and I have been applying for it for years. But when I was selected, I was also allowed to speak at COSP, at Conference of States Parties to the UNCRPD in December of 2020. And that was a valuable experience for me. And I, of course, spoke about the issues and so on. So then I was also involved in, and I was contacted by one of the diplomats when the COVID pandemic started. And she put me in contact with a representative from the UN Secretary General's Youth Envoy's Office. So UN Secretary General has an kind of like an advisor on youth issues. And her office had an interest in starting a global youth network of young persons with disabilities. And we started meeting each other, a few young people, and but then it somehow stifled. However, in summer of 2022, they announced a call for networks coordinators position, and then they asked and announced call for membership. And I applied, and we started this network. It now has a social media page on Facebook, and generally it started, somehow. So that's a promising practice. And it will eventually end up in more youth with disabilities being involved on international level. However, this again is just a start phase. I also would like to here to express that I was then hired by the UNDP, the UN Development Program in Georgia, to co-author the situation analysis on the rights of persons with disabilities for the UN Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Fund. This is a major fund put together by a few UN agencies, and they funded a project in Georgia later based on this situational assessment. And I co-authored a chapter on participation of persons with disabilities, and then I also sent it as an independent shadow report in the name of my organization, which is Disabled Women's Organization, the Platform for New Opportunities. And then this March, I was invited by the UN Development Program and funded by the UN Development Program to attend Georgia's periodic review in Geneva. So Georgia has submitted its first periodic report in 2016, but due to the pandemic and some other the fact that the CRPD committee is very overloaded, the first review happened in spring of this year, and I March 9th and 10th, and I was attending the dialogue with the civil society, which preceded the official debates with the state representatives. And I spoke about certain issues, of course, to the committee members, and I met the committee members in person as well. I would like to also emphasize that it's a big issue that the CRPD committee does not have any young member by any definition, so anyone even below the age of 35, which makes it a bit hard for youth to voice our needs to the committee. And also the visa issue that the UN does not support and does not help civil society representatives in getting visas. So for me, I was very privileged that I didn't need a visa to go to Switzerland, and I'm also very privileged that I'm now already in the United States, so I can attend the Conference of States Parties to the CRPD. However, for example, one young Turkish woman was supposed to speak at the Civil Society Forum that precedes the COSP, the upcoming COSP, and she was not able to because she did not manage to get the visa. While all the diplomats and official, UN staff have these visas without any issues. So this is another reason why it's important that young people are involved in official capacity, because then they would, have a easier path to get the visas and go to UN and actually voice their concerns. Something else I wanted to mention is recommendations, is that of course it's important to try and more deliberately to include young people with disabilities in monitoring. As I have said, a lot of young people already are doing this informally. For instance, my younger schoolmate has been advocating for tactile paths to be installed in city of Tbilisi, in the capital of Georgia, since her late teens, since she started studying at university, but even before that, while she was still in high school. And she's very passionate about this, and many other young disabled persons as well. However, of course, more deliberate thought has to be put into increasing the involvement of youth with disabilities. I guess I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you all may have. And just another final thought that, of course, for more youth with disabilities to be able to participate in the CRPD monitoring, in general, in all kinds of decision making, we have to have better services from childhood. What I mean by services is, of course, better inclusive education, independent living services, personal assistance services, housing possibilities, teaching services, mobility and orientation teaching that would enable young disabled persons to learn how to live independently, how to use different assistive equipment, and so on. And another thing is that the technology and technological development has to be inclusive, so that we would be able to actually voice our concerns via social media. The internet is becoming increasingly visualized. I had a huge difficulty. I was almost short of quitting using Facebook in early 2020 because of some renovations that happened to it. It was almost impossible. It became almost impossible to use with a screen reader. I had to start using a mobile version of it on my computer. And it didn't have a lot of features that the regular Facebook had. I also cannot use TeamViewer independently anymore, as it was upgraded. I used to be able to read its ID and password, and now I'm not because of some changes that happened, and it's not screen reader accessible anymore. I also have heard that Reddit is basically prohibiting now blind people from using screen readers, and there will be a strike by the blind community and others who are interested in expressing solidarity, because otherwise blind people will not be able to use this social media outlet.
Great. Thank you so much to Esma for that. I think you'll all agree it was such a useful contribution and touched on so many areas across her practical experience of monitoring and being engaged in monitoring by UN committees, and the practical barriers to participation, including things like visas and the accessibility of technology. And it's come up across the panel as well, the role of national human rights institutions in supporting that participation. So we've concluded with our panel contributions. We're hoping, and I think Esma and Poka should be available to join us for this questions and answer session on the screen. So we have about an hour for discussion at this point. I'm sure you're all tired, it's the afternoon, but really encourage you all to ask questions while we have such expertise in the room and the speakers. We'll have the microphones going around the room again, so I'd ask you just to wait till you have that before you start speaking, and we'll group questions just to give the speakers a bit of time to prepare their answers. And if you can continue, like this morning, to just introduce yourself, especially if you haven't spoken before, and if you want to direct your question to a particular speaker, you can just indicate that so we can ensure to include, I see Esma on the screen anyway, so we can ensure to include her in the responses. So I'll hand over to you at this point. I'm looking forward to the questions as much as the speakers, I'm sure.